November 24th, 1944. The first light of dawn drifts across the Pacific, but high above the clouds another kind of dawn is breaking. From long airstrips carved into the Marianas, silver giants rise slowly, their wings stretching wider than any bomber before them. These are the Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, machines born of endless research and vast industrial effort, now taking to the air with a single purpose: to bring the war home to Japan. Their engines roar as they climb, their fuselages gleaming in the cold morning sun, their shadows racing across the sea far below. For the men inside, this mission is unlike anything the world has seen before. They are sealed inside pressurized compartments, protected from the thin air where human lungs cannot function unaided. Their instruments glow softly, their turrets stand ready, their long flight paths traced carefully on maps. Ahead lies Tokyo, the beating heart of the Japanese Empire, and with it, a new phase of the war. To understand the weight of this moment, one must step back and look at the road that led here. Only months earlier, these islands in the Marianas were bitterly contested. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had cost lives measured in tens of thousands. Japanese defenders had fought with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned Marines and soldiers. Yet with their capture, the Pacific War shifted forever. From these islands, the B-29 could reach the Japanese home islands directly, carry its burden of bombs to the industrial centers, and return. What had once been safe behind ocean walls was now within reach of American air power. The B-29 itself was not simply another bomber. It was the result of vision and desperation, born when planners understood that victory would demand striking deep into enemy territory. Traditional bombers like the B-17 and B-24 had fought bravely in Europe, but the Pacific was vast. To reach Japan required range never before attempted, altitude beyond the reach of most interceptors, and payloads that could cripple entire cities. The answer was the Superfortress. 4 massive Wright R-3350 engines fitted with turbo superchargers to keep power at the edge of the stratosphere, a pressurized cabin to keep crews alive in the thin cold, and remote-controlled gun turrets guided by periscopic sights and electronic coordination. It was in every sense the most advanced bomber of its day. As the first formations lifted off that morning, the Japanese radar screens flickered to life. Warnings spread through air defense networks, and orders were shouted across airfields still waking from the night. Pilots scrambled to their machines, but already a grim reality loomed over them. The fighters they climbed into, Zeros, Kai-43 Oscars, Kai-61 Tonys, were legendary in their own right. Once they had dominated skies across Asia and the Pacific, but they had been designed for lower altitudes, for agility and speed in thinner combat ranges. Against bombers cruising at 30,000 feet, they were at the edge of their abilities. Engines strained as Japanese fighters clawed upward. The climb was punishing. Every 1,000 feet stolen from the sky meant a loss of horsepower, a slower rate of ascent, a greater risk of stalling in the cold, thin air. Pilots pushed their aircraft to the limit, oxygen masks biting their faces, instruments twitching as the altimeter needle climbed. Yet the bombers always seemed to remain just out of reach, cruising serenely above, their contrails marking white scars across the blue. For the bomber crews, the contrast was stark. Inside their pressurized cabins, they breathed filtered air, their bodies warm enough to function, their fingers not frozen stiff on controls. From their altitude, they looked down at fighters struggling to climb, watching them peel away one by one as engines overheated or fuel ran too low. The war in the air had become a contest of physics and engineering as much as courage, and still the mission pressed on. Below them, the city of Tokyo spread like a vast web, streets and rivers and factories all reduced to a map-like miniature from 30,000 feet. For years it had seemed untouchable, shielded by distance and defended by fighters who could harry any intruder. But now, for the first time since the war began, American bombers hovered over the capital itself. Bomb bay doors yawned open and the first bombs tumbled downward, their fins spinning as they cut through the thin air. Seconds stretched into minutes before explosions blossomed below, fire and smoke rising slowly toward the high-altitude giants. On the ground, civilians gazed upward, some in shock, others in disbelief. Air raid sirens wailed, but the reality was unavoidable. The war that had seemed so far away had arrived with thunder. For the defenders, the moment was crushing. Fighters returned to base with fuel tanks nearly dry, many having never fired a shot. Mechanics swarmed over engines pushed to breaking point, while pilots stared at the sky where the bombers had been. It was not a lack of will. It was a lack of altitude, a lack of power, a lack of the technological tools that might have made a difference. This was only the beginning. The first raids revealed a gap that would not be easily closed. Japanese planners scrambled for solutions, pressurized fighter prototypes, rockets, desperate new tactics, but such efforts were slow, hampered by shortages of materials, fuel, and time. The war was turning, and the very skies themselves had shifted in favor of the enemy. For the men flying home to the Marianas, weary from hours in the air but alive, the sense was undeniable. They had crossed the Pacific, struck at the Empire's heart, and returned. What had once been impossible was now routine. The Superfortress had proven itself, and Japan had learned a bitter truth. Altitude could be as decisive as any weapon. The first missions had shown the gap between promise and reality. The B-29 was not just another bomber. It was an omen of what modern industry and engineering could deliver. Japan's defenders had learned the hard way that courage alone could not climb fast enough, engines alone could not breathe thin air, and doctrine alone could not bridge a gulf of technology. Yet the raids of November 1944 were only a beginning. What followed was a grinding campaign where the mismatch grew more obvious with every passing month. For the Japanese high command, the alarm was not abstract. Reports poured in from pilots who had fought bravely but returned without firing their guns. They spoke of engines that choked at altitude, of propellers that could not bite the thin air, of controls that stiffened until maneuvers became impossible. They described looking up at bombers gliding smoothly, their formations intact, their bombs already falling while interceptors still fought to reach them. Mechanics confirmed the strain on machines. Airframes designed for lighter combat loads warped under the pressure of repeated climbs. Pistons overheated and seized. Turbo superchargers, the technology that gave the B-29 its advantage, were largely absent from Japanese designs. The Empire had entered the war with agility and daring, but the race had moved to heights it could not reach. Behind these tactical failures lay a deeper weakness. Japan's fuel reserves were dwindling fast. The island empire had fought desperately to seize oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, but by late 1944, American submarines and surface fleets had strangled the sea lanes. Tankers lay at the bottom of the ocean. Refineries sputtered without crude. Pilots trained on fewer hours of flight. Ground crews rationed every drop of aviation gasoline. By the time bombers appeared over Tokyo, every climb to altitude was not only dangerous, but costly, measured in fuel that could not be replaced. Each interception became a calculation of value. Was it worth burning irreplaceable fuel to send fighters against bombers they might never reach? The answer was often yes in spirit, but no in practice. Squadrons scrambled because pride demanded it, because the home islands themselves were under threat, because civilians needed to see defenders in the sky. Yet the outcomes told the truth. Fighters landed with tanks nearly empty, their engines rattling from strain, their guns unfired. Mechanics knew that every sortie consumed not only fuel, but irreplaceable parts. Spark plugs, bearings, pistons, these were not endless in supply. Japan's factories struggled under blockade and bombardment. Skilled machinists were called to the army, leaving workbenches in the hands of apprentices. The once proud arsenal of Asia now found itself patching machines with whatever could be scrounged. The psychological toll was no less severe. Pilots had been raised on the legacy of the Zero, the swift, elegant fighter that had humbled Western air forces in the early days of the war. They carried in their hearts the belief that courage and skill could overcome heavier machines. Yet now, climbing toward the B-29, they found themselves betrayed not by willpower but by physics. Some never reached firing distance. Others arrived at the edge of their performance envelopes, gasping for oxygen, only to find bombers already turning homeward. It was like dueling an opponent standing on a higher hill. Every step upward drained the challenger, while the defender remained steady. Civilians, too, felt the change. For years, propaganda had promised that Japan's skies were safe, that enemies could not penetrate the divine shield of distance and defense. Now sirens wailed over Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Families watched fighters rise and then return without victory. Children looked to the heavens and saw formations untouched. The illusion of invulnerability cracked, and with it the spirit of the home front. Inside American bombers, life was not without risk. Engines sometimes caught fire. Mechanical failures could force an aircraft down, and Japanese anti-aircraft guns did bark from below. Yet compared to the firestorms of Europe, the skies over Japan seemed less deadly. Crews understood the difference. They had been trained to expect heavy opposition, desperate swarms of interceptors, curtains of flak. Instead, they found scattered resistance, brave but thin. The enemy's weakness was not courage but altitude, and the Superfortress ruled the high cold air. As winter deepened, another enemy emerged, the jet stream. At 30,000 feet, powerful winds raced across Japan, sometimes faster than the bombers themselves. Crews watched in frustration as bombs drifted far from their targets, scattered by currents invisible from the ground. Precision became a dream. Factories remained standing after raids meant to crush them. The high technology of the B-29 was humbled not by fighters but by nature itself. Yet even scattered bombs burned fuel, tore roofs, and forced civilians into shelters. Each mission wore down the fabric of a society already strained by blockade and loss. Commanders debated tactics. Should the bombers continue at altitude, relatively safe but inaccurate? Or should they descend, risking more interception for the sake of destruction? The argument would find its answer months later in firebomb raids that turned cities into infernos. But in late 1944 and early 1945, the altitude war defined the conflict. The Americans held the high ground. The Japanese strained to climb. Fuel shortages worsened the crisis. By January 1945, many training programs had been gutted. Young pilots graduated with only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had enjoyed. They climbed into fighters scarcely tested, with engines worn by constant overuse, and faced bombers crewed by men who had spent months training in simulators, in mock raids, in endless drills. The imbalance widened. The skies became a classroom of despair, where courage met exhaustion and technology decided the grade. Factories that might have built better fighters were themselves targets. Aluminum supplies dwindled. Designs that could have closed the gap, the Kai-84, the Shidenkai, arrived in too few numbers, too late, and with engines too unreliable. The promise of jets and rockets glittered on drawing boards, but Japan lacked the resources to mass-produce them. Where Germany fielded Me-262s in the hundreds, Japan's advanced projects stalled at prototypes, victims of shortages and bombings. The empire could imagine solutions but not deliver them. So pilots adapted. Some turned to ramming tactics, aiming their machines at the massive bombers, hoping to cripple with impact what their guns could not achieve. Others volunteered for desperate new missions, special attack units whose role was not interception but sacrifice. These measures, while dramatic, revealed the truth. Conventional defense was failing. When a nation turns to ramming as a strategy, it confesses that the balance of power has tipped beyond recovery. For the Americans, each mission brought lessons. Crews learned to respect the jet stream, to adjust bomb sights, to calculate drift. Mechanics on the ground refined procedures to keep the temperamental R-3350 engines alive. Losses still came. Planes forced to ditch in the ocean, crews captured or killed, but the overall momentum favored persistence. With every raid, the skies bent further toward Allied advantage. By early 1945, the raids had moved beyond experiment. They were becoming a campaign, relentless and grinding. Factories were damaged, transportation networks strained, morale frayed. Japan still fought fiercely on land and sea, but in the air above its cities, the imbalance was unmistakable. The altitude crisis had become a national crisis, one that no amount of bravery could resolve. The war in the Pacific was entering its final phase, and the roar of the Superfortress overhead was both a symbol and a cause. It marked the point where Japan could no longer defend the skies above its own capital, where fuel and altitude and technology had conspired to tilt the scales. For civilians huddled in shelters, for pilots gasping in thin air, for commanders tallying losses, the message was clear. The empire was now under a shadow it could not lift, and still, worse was to come. The winter of 1945 brought with it a hard truth. High-altitude precision bombing had not crippled Japan as quickly as American planners hoped. The jet stream scattered bombs, accuracy was elusive, and factories often survived. But the raids were never pointless. They drained Japan's fuel, stretched its defenses thin, and reminded civilians that the enemy could strike at will. And then, in March, the strategy shifted. General Curtis LeMay, a man known for cold efficiency, took command of the bomber campaign. He studied the results and made a ruthless decision. If the jet stream scattered bombs at high altitude, then altitude must be abandoned. If precision failed, then precision would be replaced by destruction. The B-29 would descend into the night, fly lower, and carry fire instead of heavy bombs. The war in the skies was about to turn into a war of flames. On the evening of March 9th, hundreds of B-29s took off from the Marianas. They carried not the usual high-explosive ordnance, but clusters of incendiaries, small bomblets designed to ignite upon impact. Their target was Tokyo, a city built of wood and paper, a metropolis where narrow streets and tightly packed homes made fire a weapon more terrible than steel. The bombers approached at altitudes where Japanese fighters could at last reach them, but by then the defenders had little strength left. Fuel was scarce, pilots exhausted, machines unreliable. The few that did rise were swept aside or lost in the darkness. That night, Tokyo burned. The bombers released their cargo in waves, a storm of incendiaries that rained down across districts like Shitamachi. Fires leapt from building to building. The wind fed the flames until they became a firestorm, a living thing that consumed everything in its path. Civilians fled into canals and rivers, only to suffocate from the heat or drown in the crush of bodies. Within hours, vast swathes of the capital were ash and cinder. In one night, nearly 100,000 people were killed, more than in the bombings of Hamburg, Dresden, or even Hiroshima to come. From the cockpits of returning B-29s, the glow of the firestorm was visible even hundreds of miles away. Crews, hardened by combat, were shaken by the scale of destruction, yet the mission was hailed as a success. What high-altitude bombing could not achieve in months, incendiary bombing had done in a single night. And so the strategy became policy. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, one by one, the great cities of Japan fell to fire. The raids came night after night, wave after wave, until streets became ruins and survivors huddled in caves, bunkers, or burned-out shells of buildings. Civil defense struggled to cope. Buckets and sand could not stop firestorms. Fire brigades collapsed under the heat and lack of water. The scale was beyond human control. Japanese fighters tried to resist, but every sortie cost more fuel than the nation could spare. Planes that did rise were often shot down by the B-29's defensive guns or lost to accidents. Pilots flew with dwindling experience, sometimes boys scarcely trained, facing bombers crewed by veterans. Courage was plentiful, but altitude, speed, and numbers belonged to the Americans. For the Japanese people, the raids became a constant nightmare. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in days. Families slept in the open. Food grew scarce and hope thinned with every siren. The sound of B-29 engines, once strange, became a dreaded rhythm of daily life. The empire that had marched proudly across Asia now fought to survive inside its own burning walls. For the Americans, the raids confirmed the advantage of industry. Thousands of bombers could be produced, thousands of engines repaired, thousands of air crews trained. Losses, though painful, could be replaced. The balance was merciless. Where Japan could field dozens, the United States fielded hundreds. Where Japan rationed every gallon of fuel, the Americans delivered shiploads across the Pacific. The skies reflected the factories, and the factories decided the war. By the spring of 1945, Japan's air defenses were collapsing. Anti-aircraft guns still barked, but ammunition was short. Fighters still scrambled, but often failed to climb. The dream of intercepting bombers before they reached their targets had faded. Commanders knew it, civilians knew it, and pilots knew it most of all. The air war was no longer a contest. It was a one-sided pounding. And yet, despite the hopelessness, resistance did not vanish. Pilots continued to launch. Families continued to endure. The Empire still refused surrender, but the cost was staggering. By June, entire districts of major cities had ceased to exist. Industries had been shattered, transport networks fractured, and millions left homeless. The question was no longer whether Japan could stop the bombers, but how long it could endure the fire. By early 1945, the noose around Japan was tightening. The Marianas had given the Americans the ability to strike, but the distance was still punishing. Bomber crews faced missions that stretched over 14 hours, with little margin for error. For those who were damaged, fuel-starved, or wounded, the journey home often ended in the sea. Many men owed their lives to the submarines that prowled along the bomber routes, pulling exhausted crews from rafts and wreckage. But another solution was already taking shape. An island whose name would soon become legend, Iwo Jima, just 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Iwo Jima lay halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. Its value was not in resources, but in geography. From its airstrips, Japanese fighters rose to harass the superfortresses. From its radar stations, warnings went out to Tokyo before the bombers even arrived. And for the Americans, it offered a promise, a place where crippled B-29s could land, and where escort fighters could finally join the long-range raids. In February 1945, Marines stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. The battle would become one of the bloodiest of the Pacific War. The Japanese, dug into bunkers and tunnels beneath the volcanic soil, resisted with a ferocity that defied imagination. Weeks of shelling had barely touched them. The iconic flag raising atop Mount Suribachi came early in the campaign, but the fighting continued for another month. In the end, nearly the entire Japanese garrison perished, fighting to the last man. The cost to the Marines was staggering, nearly 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded. But the airstrips were taken, and with them, the fate of the skies above Japan shifted again. From Iwo Jima, the long-range P-51 Mustang could finally join the war against the home islands. Sleek, fast, and deadly, the Mustang had already proven itself over Europe, sweeping German fighters from the sky. Now they would fly alongside the B-29s, protecting them from takeoff to target. For Japanese pilots, the effect was devastating. The chance of catching a bomber alone in the sky disappeared. Any attempt to climb toward the bombers now risked attack from Mustangs diving like hawks from above. On April 7, 1945, the first major raid with Mustang escorts struck Tokyo. That day, American pilots claimed more than 100 Japanese planes destroyed, for the loss of only a handful of their own. The imbalance was crushing. For every veteran ace Japan sent into the sky, another was lost, replaced by an inexperienced youth with barely 100 hours of flight time. Training schools had been shortened, fuel was scarce, and the complex maneuvers of high-altitude interception were beyond most new recruits. Desperation gave rise to desperate tactics. Already the Empire had embraced the kamikaze at sea, hurling aircraft into American warships in suicide attacks. Now some pilots turned their bodies into weapons in the skies above Japan itself. Ramming attacks against B-29s became more frequent. A fighter would climb, engine screaming, then hurl itself into a bomber's wing or tail. Sometimes the pilot bailed out in time. Often he did not. To many Japanese commanders, this was not strategy, but necessity. Conventional interception was failing, and the B-29s continued to come. Yet even this sacrifice achieved little. For every bomber lost, dozens still reached their targets. For every pilot who gave his life, factories, fuel stores, and homes continued to burn. The Americans built faster than Japan could destroy. The imbalance of industry, once an abstract equation, was now written in fire across Japanese cities. The strain on Japan's defenses was visible everywhere. Airfields lay cratered and broken. Fuel reserves dwindled to fumes. Mechanics stripped wrecks for spare parts, patching fighters together with whatever could be salvaged. Pilots climbed into cockpits knowing their odds of survival shrank with each mission. and civilians watched from the ground as the men meant to defend them failed again and again to stop the bombers overhead. By the summer of 1945, the air war had shifted from battle to attrition. The Japanese could no longer hope to contest the skies. Their fighters rose less often, their attacks less fierce. The defense of the homeland had become a matter of pride rather than strategy. And in the skies above, the bombers kept coming, escorted, relentless, unstoppable. August 1945. The cities of Japan lay in ruins, fire-scorched and broken. Industries were shattered, fuel was gone, rail lines twisted heaps of steel. Yet the B-29s still came, day after day, their silver wings glinting high above. For months, Japanese defenders had risen to challenge them, but by now the skies were almost empty. The great air battles were over. The bombers flew largely unopposed, their raids answered only by the distant thud of flak, or the faint trails of a few desperate fighters who rarely reached their altitude. But within this relentless campaign, a new and secret mission was unfolding. Deep in the United States, scientists had labored in secrecy on a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. While B-29s rained destruction with fire and steel, another project, the Manhattan Project, prepared to unleash power from the atom itself. By the summer of 1945, that weapon was ready, and the aircraft chosen to deliver it was none other than the B-29 Superfortress. On the morning of August 6th, a single bomber rose from the island of Tinian. Its name was Enola Gay. Unlike the massed formations of earlier raids, it flew with only a small escort. Its mission was not firebombing, but something entirely new. The target was Hiroshima, a city of military importance, but also home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened and a weapon code-named Little Boy fell toward the city. Seconds later, a light brighter than the sun split the sky. The blast wave flattened the heart of Hiroshima in an instant. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. Tens of thousands died in the first moments. Tens of thousands more in the hours and days that followed. Survivors staggered through the wreckage, their skin burned and blistered, their shadows seared into walls. For the first time in history, a single bomb had destroyed a city. 3 days later, a second mission followed. This time the target was Nagasaki. The bomber boxcar carried the weapon called Fat Man. Clouds obscured the primary target, forcing the crew to divert. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, the bomb detonated. Again, devastation unlike anything imagined spread outward. Factories collapsed, homes disintegrated, and fire swept through the valleys. Another city lay in ruins. For the Japanese leadership, the choice was now stark. Their armies were shattered, their fleet destroyed, their skies dominated. Cities had burned under the reign of incendiaries, and now entire populations were vanishing under single atomic blasts. Even the most hardened generals could no longer deny the truth. The Empire had no defense against the B-29, no answer to the atom. On August 15th, the voice of Emperor Hirohito reached his people. For the first time in history, the Emperor spoke to the nation directly. His words were careful, poetic, but the meaning was clear. Japan would accept surrender. The war was over. In the days that followed, B-29s no longer dropped bombs but supplies. The same bomb bays that had carried fire and destruction now carried food, medicine, and hope to a starving population. On airfields across Japan, once dedicated to scrambling fighters, American bombers now landed unchallenged. Where once there had been defiance, there was now silence. The final act of air combat came strangely, after surrender. On August 18th, American B-32 reconnaissance bombers flew over Tokyo. A few Japanese fighters, unwilling or perhaps unaware of the Emperor's words, rose to intercept. In the brief skirmish that followed, an American crewman was killed, the last combat casualty of the war. Even in its last breath, the conflict ended as it had been fought, in the skies, with bombers flying above and fighters struggling to reach them. The war was finished. The bombers had done their work. The B-29 had proven not just a weapon, but a symbol of an industrial might that could not be matched. In the end, altitude, fire, and the atom had broken an empire. The guns had fallen silent. Across Europe and Asia, soldiers laid down their arms, civilians stepped from shelters, and nations began to count the cost. For Japan, defeat meant ruins that stretched beyond the horizon. Cities once vibrant were reduced to ashes. Industry, transport, and infrastructure lay shattered. But the war in the air had left scars that reached far deeper than bricks and stone. For the men who had flown the missions, victory brought little celebration. Many remembered the endless hours in cramped bomb bays, the thunder of flak, the sight of comrades spiraling down in flames. For the crews of the B-29, the war had been a test not only of machines, but of endurance. Missions had stretched 15 hours, pushing human limits of fatigue, hunger, and fear. Even as victory was declared, many struggled with memories that would never fade. The flash of cities burning below, the screams carried faintly on the wind. The realization of what total war had meant. For Japan's surviving pilots, the legacy was different. They had fought against impossible odds, climbing into cockpits with machines that were outmatched, short of fuel and too few in number. Many felt shame at their failure to defend the homeland. Others felt pride that they had flown at all. The kamikaze pilots were remembered as symbols of sacrifice, though their efforts had done little to change the outcome. In the post-war years, veterans of both sides would meet again, not as enemies, but as men who had faced the same merciless sky. The B-29 itself became more than just an airplane. It stood as a symbol of American industrial strength, of innovation, and of the strategy of long-range precision bombing. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled guns, and immense range marked it as the most advanced bomber of its age. It had carried firebombs, high explosives, and, in its final missions, the atomic bombs that reshaped history itself. But with that power came questions. The destruction of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, these were not battlefields, but cities filled with civilians. Historians, generals, and civilians alike would debate for decades whether the bombing campaign was justified, whether the atomic bomb was necessary, whether victory demanded such a price. For the men who ordered the missions, the answer was simple. The faster the war ended, the more lives would be saved on both sides. For those who lived beneath the bombs, the questions were not so easily answered. In the aftermath, Japan rebuilt. From the ashes of war rose a new nation, one that would embrace peace, industry, and technology in ways few could have predicted in 1945. Cities once destroyed became centers of commerce. Factories once targeted rebuilt stronger. The lessons of the air war remained etched into the memory of a generation. That the sky could bring not only freedom, but also unimaginable destruction. For the world at large, the legacy of the B-29 was clear. It had ushered in a new era of warfare, one where oceans could no longer shield nations, where cities were no longer safe behind borders, and where air power alone could decide the fate of empires. The Superfortress was the bridge between the wars of the past and the nuclear age that followed. In 1946, the United States conducted surveys across Japan to measure the effects of the bombing. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, rail systems collapsed, and industries crippled. Yet the resilience of the people was undeniable. Despite the devastation, Japan's spirit endured. Within a generation, the country would rise as a global power once again, trading the sword for the plow and the Zero for the passenger jet. The bombers themselves found new roles. Some were scrapped, others turned into test platforms, reconnaissance planes, or transports. But the shadow of their wartime missions never truly faded. For those who had built them, flown them, or faced them, the B-29 remained a machine tied forever to both victory and tragedy. And so the story ends where it began, in the skies. High above the earth, where thin air meets silence, the course of nations was decided. The men who climbed into those bombers and fighters did not know they were shaping history. They only knew the next mission, the next target, the next day they had to survive. Yet in their endurance, in their sacrifice, and in the fire they unleashed, they changed the world forever. The Second World War closed with cities in ruins and nations reborn. The skies that once echoed with engines grew quiet. But the memory of the bombers remained. Silver wings against the dawn, the thunder of bombs falling through the clouds, the trails of smoke rising from burning cities. This was the legacy of the B-29, a weapon of war, a symbol of power, a harbinger of a new age. Its story was not just one of destruction, but of transformation, the end of one world and the beginning of another.